how's it going? My name is Gabby. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about every book that I DNF'd in the year of 2023. And if you don't know what that means, DNF just means did not finish. And so in this video, I'm going to be telling you about the 20 books that I DNF'd in the year of 2023. And these aren't books that I just got maybe 20 to 30 pages into. No, these are books that I got at least 50 pages into, if not more. Some of these I even got over 100 pages in before I decided to DNF them. Some of these you probably know about from my wrap-ups, but some of these you might not know about because I haven't even talked about them yet. I actually had so many DNFs in the month of December, I don't know what's going on with me. I feel like especially in the last 2 years, I've gotten a lot more comfortable with DNFing, because I know that this might be a little bit controversial because some readers are like, no, once I start a book, I'm going to finish it. And I love that other people have that much motivation because for me, reading should be enjoyable, and if I'm not enjoying a book after 50 to even 100 pages in, I don't see any point in me forcing myself to continue to read it unless I'm reading it for something like a book club or something where I do have more of a reason where I should be finishing the book. But if you're reading something for enjoyment, life is too short. You can always pick it back up another time if you just feel like you aren't in the mood for it right now. And so I'm gonna let you know about the 20 books that I decided to DNF this year and why I DNF'd them. But before we do jump into the video, I just wanted to take a second to thank today's video sponsor, which is Factor. Because Factor makes meeting your nutrition goals easier than ever by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian approved meals right to your door. They have a team of gourmet chefs who create each meal using only ingredients with integrity so that you can be feeling your best all day long. You can cross meal prepping off of your to-do list this holiday season when you use Factor because you can skip the extra grocery runs, you can skip the preparation and the cleanup that all comes with making food, and you can still have a very high quality meal that's ready in just 2 minutes. Yes, you just pop this into the microwave for 2 minutes, or you can put it into your oven for a little bit longer, and you have a fresh meal ready to go within 2 minutes. What a freaking game changer. You can treat yourself to some high quality, delicious meals over this holiday season. You can choose from over 35 chef-crafted meals that support a healthy lifestyle, and these meals can also help to meet your meal preferences, whether you're looking for something that's either light on the calories, heavy on the protein, or if you're looking for vegan or vegetarian options, they do have something for everyone. My favorite thing about these Factor meals is the convenience with how quickly you can have such nutritious food. For example, some of their chicken dishes are some of my absolute favorites, and it makes lunchtime or dinner time just so much less stressful. So you can head to factor75.com or use the link in my description and use my code gabbyreads50 to get 50% off your first box with Factor. Isn't that such an amazing deal? You go to factor75.com, you use my code gabbyreads50 to get 50% off your first box. That is so exciting. Thank you so much to Factor for sponsoring today's video, and now let's get on to the books. Alright, so jumping into all of the books that I DNF'd this year, the first one I want to talk to you about is Mr. Magic, which this one is a bit of a bummer, but I think it's also not that surprising that I would DNF this one considering my history with this author, because the last book that this author published was the book Hide, which came out in 2022, and I think that one was a 1-star book for me. I just really despised it. But I was really interested in Mr. Magic because of the premise. The idea of this book just sounded really cool. It was a thriller horror book that was going to involve this TV show where all of these kids were on a TV show back in the day that was called Mr. Magic, and it involved some kind of weird magical elements that were never fully explained, and the show got shut down because there was a bunch of controversy around the show, and now 20 or 30 years later or something, there was going to be a reboot of the show, and all of the original cast was going to be reuniting, and it just sounded like something I could really enjoy. But this was one, I think I got about 100 or maybe even 150 pages into this one before I decided to DNF. I personally found the story to be a little bit hard to follow at times, what was even going on. Most of the time I just felt confused. And then I also had a similar experience with this one, with the same experience that I had with the book Hide, in that all of these characters were supposed to be I think in their 30s or maybe even in their 40s, but they read young adult characters. And maybe there was more of a reason for that in Mr. Magic that I didn't get to the explanation, but it just drove me nuts. And so I think it's safe to say that this author just isn't for me. I don't think I'm going to be continuing to read her books in the future just because we clearly don't vibe with the writing styles. After a 1-star and a DNF, I think it's safe to say I'm done with this author. A romance book that I DNF'd this year that I was really upset about is Hello Stranger. I was especially sad to DNF this one after how much I loved The Bodyguard when I read it recently. I have read a few other romance books from this author, and I've never loved any of them until The Bodyguard, so I really thought things were turning around for me with this author. I really thought Hello Stranger would be a new favorite, but unfortunately, I was not a fan of Hello Stranger, and I was actually, this book gave me so much anxiety, which is an experience that I don't really want when I'm reading a romance book. I read romance books for, pure escapism, I don't want to be thinking about about real life medical trauma and shit like that. Because in this book, you know, right at the start of this book, she finds out that she has like a tumor or like something on her brain, and they have to perform this brain surgery, and then the brain surgery gives her facial blindness. And that's kind of like what this story is about, like Hello Stranger, because she has facial blindness, so like she can't recognize the guy's face that she's falling in love with in the book, which is fine, but like the medical stuff at the beginning was giving me so much anxiety, like what the heck? And I feel like this book just kept emphasizing how like scary her situation was, and how like this is a once in a million like medical emergency thing that happened to her. And I just have that kind of brain where like I overthink everything and I get really scared. Like I'm a hypochondriac, you know, like I don't like reading about, you know, doctors telling the characters, well, you're like a 1 in a million case, like this doesn't happen to everyone, but it did happen to you. It just gives me a lot of anxiety to read stuff like that, and so I just was not having a fun time with this. And I also feel like the writing in general, like the characters were really annoying in this book. It felt very insta-love to me. Like as soon as she saw the love interest, she was like planning their whole future in her head, and she was like already naming their children after their first conversation. I was just completely frustrated with everything about this book, so it was definitely a DNF for me. I would have rated this very low if I had finished it. I just know it. I also read The Only Survivors by Megan Miranda. I want to say that I DNF'd this one about 150 pages in. Like I did get pretty into this one, and you know the wildest thing is that I read this book back in April this year, and I cannot recall a single thing about those 150 pages. I can't even remember. I think there was like some kind of incident that happened with their group of friends like a long time ago, and now they're reconnecting again. I think that's what this one was about. I don't know, the fact that this book left literally no impression on me at all just says a lot right there. I think Megan Miranda too, if I'm remembering correctly, I've DNF'd several of her books now, and I think I've only finished one that I can think of, and that book is one that I didn't really end up enjoying. So I really just think Megan Miranda might not be the author for me. I don't know what it is about her writing style with thrillers, but I just do not vibe. I am so embarrassed to admit how often I will pick up a book that I know I might not like just because the cover is stunning. That was definitely a situation that happened here. I also ended up DNFing the book Someone Had to Do It, and this one was sad. I was so sad about DNFing this one because I really wanted to enjoy this one because the authors are fucking cool. They're really cool humans. They're so freaking sweet and so kind. And this thriller, it just didn't work for me in particular because I feel like this is one of those thrillers that was very heavy with tropes that I don't usually like. Like there was a lot of romance in this thriller. There was a lot of sex scenes. There was also a lot of like blackmailing or like revenge kind of storyline going on. And those are usually my least favorite tropes when it comes to thrillers. Like I don't care about thrillers that are about like revenge and blackmail as like the primary thrilling thing that's going on in books. And so unfortunately this one just wasn't for me. It wasn't a bad book by any means. It just wasn't for me. I also ended up DNFing Spells for Forgetting, which this one might be a temporary DNF because I could see myself trying this book again in the future. It's just that at the time that I was reading this, I felt like this book was a little bit outside of my comfort zone and I was getting a little bit annoyed with the characters at the time. This one it leans a little bit into the fantasy. It's kind of like fantasy magical realism. There's like really strong island vibes in this book. There's like a girl that goes missing and you're following, there's kind of like a romance happening in this book too. And I really liked the vibes. Like the atmosphere in this book was really great. However, I did feel like the characters read a little bit younger than they were intended to be, which is why I was a little bit annoyed with the storyline. And then some of the fantasy elements felt like they were going over my head a little bit, you know, because fantasy is just a genre that's a little bit outside of my comfort zone. But this is one that I've just been so curious about, and especially like the author's new book that she just came out with. I actually just hauled that recently, the one that's like the unmaking of June Farrow. That one also looks really interesting, and so I'm willing to give this one another shot in the future. And then I also DNF'd Slooh Foot for kind of like similar reasons because this is just something that is so outside of my comfort zone. But I had major FOMO. Like everybody was talking about this book and hyping it up so much that I was like, maybe, you know, like you never know. Like I'm always more than willing to give books that are more fantasy or historical or something that's kind of outside of my comfort zone. Like I want to be giving them a chance, especially if they're like incredibly hyped by people that I know and trust their reviews. And so I decided to give Slooh Foot a shot. I want to say I only got like 60 to 80 pages into this one before I decided to DNF because the fantasy and the historical elements, I feel like it was more so the historical elements and just like the way the book was written. I found it so hard to get into it. I don't know why. I have like a tiny peanut-sized brain when it comes to understanding fantasy and historical fiction sometimes. And this was definitely one of those books where there was just a disconnect between me and the book. Like I could not get into it for the life of me. Some of the romances that I DNF'd this year include the book Icebreaker. This is one that I was kind of excited about, you know, because I do love ice hockey romance, and the fact that the girl was like a figure skater, I think, and then the guy was a hockey player, and I think it was like a college college setting. I was pretty excited at the idea of this one, but the writing in this book, oh, no. The writing was just not it. I think this is a book that got really popular on TikTok, and I just, I love it for other people, but for me personally, I could not get into this book. I thought the characters also in this one read a lot younger than they were intended. Like, the main character read like she was like 16 to me, and I just couldn't get into this one. I didn't really like any of the characters. I found them all to be very juvenile and very annoying. And then similarly to that last book, I also DNF'd Pucking Around. And I know you're probably looking at me like, Gabby, why the fuck did you even pick up that book to begin with? And like, you're right, this is not the book for me. But this romance is about 700 pages long, and I was only listening to it on audio, and it was about 25 hours long, and I listened to the first 2 hours of this audiobook before I decided to DNF. Something I didn't realize about this book, because I had just seen this book going around on like TikTok, or like it was just getting hyped in other places, not really on booktube. I don't think I've ever seen anybody talk about this book on booktube, but I was just curious, because I have loved some hockey romances in the past, so I was like, why not give it a shot? This book was just very smutty. I mean, it was very smutty from those first opening 2 hours that I listened to. I was like, oh my gosh, wow. And I think this book is mainly just like 700 pages of smut, which like, if you love that, cool, I'm so happy for you. I just don't think this is the kind of book for me. Like, this is not what I'm looking for when it comes to romance, and like, no shame at all if it's something that you're looking for in your romance books. But also, I didn't realize that this was gonna be a situation where it's not exactly like a love triangle, from what I understand, but there's like 3 love interests. I think it's like the main girl, and then there's 3 love interests, and it's like a why choose. From what I understand, I don't really know. I'm not familiar with this genre of romance, to be honest, at all. So I don't really know what that means, but it's like a why choose romance. So it's like she's just with all 3 of them, I think. I don't know. I didn't get that far into the book, so clearly I don't know what I'm talking about. Like, take my review with a grain of salt. Another romance that I ended up DNFing is the one Meet Me at the Lake. And this is another situation where it might just be the case that this author is not the author for me, because the last book that I read from this author was Every Last Summer, I believe, and that was one that I gave like 2 stars. Like, I really did not see the hype with that one. Like, I did not understand. I feel like this author is this generation's like Nicholas Sparks or something, where her books are like really over the top and dramatic, and they take place in the South, and it follows like a guy and a girl, and I just don't really get the hype with her writing. Like, I feel like her writing is the kind of writing where like she's desperately trying to make the reader feel emotional, and it just feels very cringy and cheesy to me personally. I don't know why, I just don't tend to like her writing in her books, and so this one was a DNF for me. I only ended up getting about 100 pages or less into this one as well. Then another romance that I DNF'd this year was The True Love Experiment by Christina Lauren, which this one was truly unfortunate, because Christina Lauren is an author that I consider to be like one of my favorite romance authors. They've definitely written some of my favorite romance books that I've ever read, and so anytime that I feel like let down by a Christina Lauren book, there's always that extra blow because, they're an author that I've loved in the past. This is one that I listened to on audio at the time, and I want to say I only got somewhere between like 50 to 100 pages into this one, so I didn't make it very far, and I DNF'd this one early in the year. Like, I read this one right when it was publishing around May, and so my memory on this one is a little bit fuzzy, I'm not gonna lie, but from what I remember, this is actually the second book in a series, and I wasn't a huge fan of the first book to begin with, but I was just curious about this one because the premise for this one sounded incredibly intriguing, because we follow a romance novelist and a documentary filmmaker. Those are 2 jobs that I am very interested in reading about, and I'm kind of surprised that this one has really high reviews on Goodreads. It has like a 4.17 average right now with like 86,000 ratings, so like that is pretty surprising to me. I don't know what it was about this book. I was just bored out of my mind from the beginning. I didn't really like the characters. I felt like they were very one-dimensional and had no chemistry, and they just like, they were so flat on the page, you know what I mean? Like, I just couldn't get invested. I guess you'll have to let me know if you think that this is a book that you think that I would like if I tried to pick it up again in the future. And I know with Christina Lauren these days, there's such a hit or miss author for me, but I feel like I'm always willing to try their new books because of how much I've loved some of their books in the past. Oh, another romance that I did DNF this year was that one You Again. This is one that I got like 150 or maybe even 180 pages into this one before I DNF'd. I don't know, for me personally, I thought these characters had like no chemistry to the point where it was like kind of awkward to be reading the story. I think the main reason why I DNF'd this one was because I was not a huge fan of these characters. Like, I just didn't really like either of them. I thought she, as a protagonist, like, she could be very like straightforward, but almost in a way that she was kind of like harsh and like mean at some times, at least from what I remember. I just didn't really care for her as a character, and I know I say all the time that like I don't need to like characters to enjoy a book, but I also feel like like in romance books in particular, that's probably the exception for me, because in a romance book, I feel like I need to be able to connect with the characters and like the characters to, you know, root for their romance. Another book that I ended up DNFing this year is Tell the Machine Goodnight. This one was actually a more like sci-fi kind of book that I was trying to read for the video that I did where I was like reading books like Black Mirror, or like reading books that are recommended for being kind of similar to Black Mirror. This book was really interesting because the reason why it gets compared to Black Mirror a lot is because we're following a character who works as a happiness technician, and it's literally her job to like make people happy. It says she provides customers with personalized recommendations for greater contentment, which I think is so interesting. And then we also follow her son, and it says he seems to find greater satisfaction in being unhappy. The very rejection of joy is his own kind of pursuit of happiness. It says this story playfully illuminates our national obsession with positive psychology and our reliance on quick fixes and technology, which I think the idea of this book is really strong. I thought the concept sounded very cool, but the execution of this book was just not my favorite, and I'm kind of bummed about it because I remember being really intrigued by this one for the first like 50 pages or the first 100 pages, but then I do think there's a change in this book. Like if I'm remembering correctly, there's a point where you hit like a part 2 or something changes, like it's either the perspective changes or something like that happens, and then I found the book so boring after that point. From what I remember, you read about like the son's perspective as well, and like his perspective in particular just like bored me to tears. I really liked reading from the protagonist. Like I remember liking her point of view the most. For the most part, I just think this is one of those books that has a really great premise that couldn't live up to the expectations of a cool premise like that for me. Another book that I would say similar things about is Looking Glass Sound by Catriona Ward. This is another one that it has such a cool premise. It sounds like it would be something that I would really like, and because I've previously enjoyed books from this author before, I thought for sure this would be something I would enjoy, but this is one that I got about 60 pages into before I DNF'd. This one just sounds so cool because it takes place on the coast of Maine. We're following this guy who's going to be writing the last book he will ever write, and the story that he's writing is the story of his childhood summer companions and the killer that stalked their small town. You know, the premise of this one just sounds so cool, but in the first 60 pages of this book, we're just following these like young teen characters who are absolutely insufferable. Like they are the worst. Like they're so annoying to read about, and I don't know if this book will like later on do the thing where like you change perspectives from like the teens to like when they're older. Like I don't know if that's the situation that's happening in this book, but I thought the teens perspective, like oh my god, it was just so annoying to read from his point of view, and I could not get invested in this story because I thought the characters were so obnoxious. And I also ended up DNFing the book Tell Me I'm Worthless, which this is one that I was so sad to have to DNF because this is a trans author in the horror community, and of course I want to be supportive of trans authors in the horror community, especially because there are so few books in the horror genre that have trans representation in them, so that's why it was extra devastating to have to DNF this one. This was a book that had a full list of trigger warnings that I thought were very difficult to read about. Like there are so many trigger warnings. The author actually does list all of the trigger warnings on like the front, like one of the first pages as like content warnings for the book. And for me personally, I had to DNF this book because not only was I not a fan of the writing style just in general, like I thought the writing style was it's like one of those writing styles that's very, very wordy and very poetic, but almost in a way where like I can't really get a grasp on like what's even going on in the story. But I also thought some of the sexual violence in this book was just a little bit too much for me, and it was really sad and really freaking depressing. I also think some of the homophobia and the transphobia in this book was it was a little bit too hard to stomach for me, I'm not gonna lie. And I know that these books are important and that they're there for a reason and that these things do happen in real life, and that's why it was just turning my stomach even more. I just don't think at the time that I was reading this, I was in a good mental space to be reading something like this. Like this book is very heavy, so just know that if you're planning to read this book. And then just to jump off of what I was just saying, I also ended up DNFing the book The Devil of Nan King, and this is one that I'm also really sad that I had to DNF. I think I DNF'd this one about like 150 pages into this book, and this is one that when I read it, I wasn't even sure if this book would really be my thing or not. And this story is about this English woman who goes to Japan because she's trying to find video footage or like documentary footage from this massacre that happened in 1937 in Nanking. I know a lot of people were recommending this to me because they said it was one of the most like memorable horror books that they had ever read, or like it really left an impression on them because of how horrific some things in this book are. And I can definitely see that, and I can definitely see why. Even though I ended up DNFing this book, I actually ended up looking up full spoilers for the ending of this book because I just wanted to see what it was that everybody was talking about that happens in this book, and I could not be more glad about the fact that I decided to DNF, because when I was reading some of those spoilers, I was like, what the heck? Like, that is truly so dark and so horrific, and yeah, I don't know if it was something that I could have handled reading. And I also ended up DNFing Spin a Black Yarn, which is the Josh Malerman short story collection. Gosh, you know it's bad when I have to DNF a short story collection. You know, like in this short story collection, there are 5 short stories. I DNF'd the first 3 before I just completely gave up and like DNF'd the entire book because I was like, I'm not gonna waste my time reading these next 2 stories. This is another one of those situations where I was pretty bummed about the fact that I didn't like this one because Josh Malerman is another one of those authors that's very hit or miss for me. But when Josh Malerman is a hit, it's usually like a 5-star like new favorite book for me, and so that's why I'm always willing to give his new stuff a chance. And it's crazy because one of my favorite books from him ever is A House at the Bottom of a Lake, which is like a short story. So like I know that Josh Malerman is capable of writing a really great 5-star short story for me, but unfortunately in this collection, this just did not do it for me. And this is the second collection of short stories from Josh Malerman that I've DNF'd because I also DNF'd the book, was it called Goblin? His other short story collection. I remember DNFing that one too because I was so annoyed that all of the stories were not that great. I also ended up DNFing the book Rouge by Mona Awad, and this is a story that I also got, I want to say about like 120 pages into this one before I decided to DNF. This one was a bummer to DNF, obviously, because I love the book Bunny from Mona Awad, and I do really like her writing style, even though her writing style can be kind of weird and kind of feel like a fever dream and you don't really know what's going on. But I feel like especially with this book, I not only had no idea what was going on, but I just didn't love the writing in this one either as much as I typically love the writing in Mona Awad books. Like the amount of times that Tom Cruise is mentioned in this book, like why? I also just think like, I don't know, I was struggling to get invested in the story. Like I just never felt like I cared about anything that was happening. This story has a lot to say about like beauty and about like beauty standards and all of those things. So I know that that's the reason why a lot of people really love this one who do love this book. I just couldn't bring myself to finish it. I just didn't care. Like after 120 pages, I was still not invested in the story or where the story was going or what was going on. And I was afraid that this book would put me in a reading slump, to be honest. So I just had to DNF it. I just didn't care. The last 3 books that I DNF'd have been all books that I've been DNFing in the month of December. Like why have I been DNFing so many books this month? The first one that I DNF'd was actually Good Girls Don't Die by Christina Henry, and I got 93 pages into this one before I decided to DNF, and I was super bummed about the fact that I had to DNF this one because Christina Henry wrote Near the Bone, which is like one of my favorite horror books of all time. So I was highly anticipating this one, but unfortunately it just did not live up to the expectations. In this story, what really appealed to me was the fact that we were going to be following 3 different women. This is about 3 women who find themselves trapped inside stories they know aren't their own. And I was like, what the heck does that mean? Like that sounds so cool. But this book is divided into 3 different parts, and so what I realized is that each section of the book is only dedicated to one of the women. So like we only know about the first woman's story in this first part of the book, and I found her part to be so obnoxious because like almost the entire part of this book she's just constantly wondering like, where am I? Who are these people? What are my memories? Why can't I remember anything? And it's just so repetitive. It feels like another thriller that I've read before. It just feels like nothing new. Like I feel like I've seen this time and time again, and it just read like such a generic thriller to me. Like I'm not invested at all to see what's going on. I actually really did not want to read part 2 because I'm like, oh my gosh, now we're just going to change to a different woman and read probably the same thing of her being like, what? Who are these people? What are my memories? I don't know. I've heard from so many people who have finished this book that the ending is just kind of ridiculous and confusing and underwhelming, and so I'm totally fine with like not having finished this. Like I don't have any FOMO, like I don't need to know how it ends. I don't care enough to know how it ends. So like that's a bad sign from me. I also, as I just mentioned in my last vlog, I did DNF Sisters of the Lost Nation. This is one that I only got 88 pages into before I decided to DNF. And I'm not gonna lie, the main reason why I DNF'd this one at the time was because of the audiobook. There's just something about the girl's voice on the audiobook. Oh my gosh, it's pretty bad. Like it's really annoying. I don't know why, for me, listening to this on audio was like excruciating. It was just very annoying. I wasn't a fan of this audiobook. And so this is one of those DNFs where like I might try it again in the future, just like reading this book physically, but I also just don't know if this is the kind of book for me. Like the way that this story is being told is just not investing me in the story the way that I thought it would, because we're doing a lot of like jumping back and forth between days, and I'm also finding the timeline can be a little bit hard to follow at times because of that. So like I don't really know if this is gonna end up being my thing or not, but for now this one's a temporary DNF. This is one that I can see myself picking up again in the future, so I'm gonna hang on to this. And then the last book that I ended up DNFing most recently this year was actually Love Light Farms, which I know I'm probably getting a lot of side eyes right now because a lot of people absolutely love this romance book, but I got 99 pages into this book. I got all the way up to chapter 8 before I decided to DNF because I was really excited about this book because it's a romance story that involves like fake dating, and I wanted to read this for like the Christmassy vlog that I was going to be working on this month. she needs to fake date this guy in order to try to save her Christmas tree farm. Like, that's kind of the general premise of this. And I was excited because I do love fake dating, and I was like, heck yes, like, let's go, like, sign me up. What I didn't realize is, like, the guy that she's gonna be fake dating in this book is, like, one of her, like, closest friends, like, basically, like, ever since childhood. And so this really actually reads more like a friends to lovers romance, which is not one of my favorite tropes in romance, and I just can't stand it. I think it's so freaking boring. Like, the first 100 pages have been so boring, and I think it's boring because it's very obvious to me that they're so in love with each other and they're just not saying anything about it. This is why friends to lovers is so boring to me, because I'm like, we know that you have feelings for each other and neither one of you are just willing to say anything yet, so it's just like boring to me. Like, I need the banter, I need the like steam, I need some tension between them, you know, like there's nothing. It's just like you're just waiting for them to acknowledge the fact that they have feelings for each other, and I just find that incredibly boring. I'm also just not the biggest fan in general of like Christmas romances. I don't know why. I always try to be like a Christmas girly, or like I want to be the kind of girl that like enjoys a Christmas book, but for some reason I really can't. Like, I can only think of like 1 or 2 books off the top of my head that are like Christmas kind of romances that I've enjoyed in my lifetime. It's just not for me. I don't know why I keep trying to make it happen, and it's just not for me. Alright, so those are all of the books that I DNF'd in the year of 2023. I know it's still, you know, somewhat early in December, so like there is a possibility I could DNF more books before the end of the year. And so if I do end up DNFing more books before the end of the year, I'll let you know about them in my December wrap-up video. But these are the 20 books that I feel like I got the most time invested in these. Like, I actually made an effort to read these, whereas like there's been plenty more books. Like, I can make this list probably twice the size if I included books that I read about like 10 to 30 pages of. Like, sometimes I'll read the first chapter and be like, yep, nope. So you'll have to let me know if you've read any of these books. What are your thoughts on them? Do you think that I made the right decision to DNF, or are there any books on this list that you're like, no, you absolutely need to finish this one because it's iconic? Let me know all of your thoughts down below, and also let me know which books did you DNF in the year of 2023? Like, do you have any controversial opinions when it comes to books that you've DNF'd? I would love to know all of your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching today. I will see you very soon with another video. Bye!